Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event with Jemar Tisby, the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Color of Compromise, and his most recent publication, the topic of tonight, How to Fight Racism. To all of you who are joining in from no matter where you are, we are thrilled that you're participating in tonight's event, not because we care about YouTube analytics, but because we actually care about the pursuit of racial justice. And the fact that you are here and tuning in to learn more about how you can become equipped in this fight encourages us greatly. It is our hope tonight's event inspires and empowers all of us to become more effective in our efforts for justice. So thank you so much for being a community in this evening's conversation. My name is Kevin, and tonight's event is being sponsored by three faith communities: Spark.Church, the River Church Community, and Congregation Eitz Chaim, all of us located here in the Bay Area of California. I'm going to now turn it over to my friend and partner, Rabbi Chaim from Congregation Eitz Chaim, and he's going to offer his welcome and greetings specifically for Spark-Inettes. Rabbi Chaim?
Welcome, Eitzniks, Sparkers, friends. I'm speaking to you from our Beit Knesset, our house of gathering. This is where both of our communities used to gather, one on the Jewish Sabbath and one on the Christian Sabbath. It makes me sad to think of how long it's been since we've gathered here in our sacred space. And yet today, here we are gathering together in a new way. If we can't do it the way we used to do it, then we need to find new ways. And I think this is an important metaphor when encountering racism. The way we've been doing it hasn't been working. We need to find new ways. And for me, it starts with learning and listening. I recently finished John Meacham's biography of John Lewis called His Truth is Marching On. I'm always inspired by how Lewis's faith, his religious conviction, kept him marching on in spite of all the physical and emotional beatings he encountered in his fight for justice. Together with MLK, they knew they couldn't do it alone. It would take a beloved community. He said, "The beloved community is an all-inclusive world, society based on simple justice, dignity, and the worth of every human being, and that is the kingdom of God." That is how I understand a part of the Aleinu prayer, which says, "Litaken olam b'malchut Shaddai," to fix the world towards a kingdom of God. In our beloved religious community, we are moving together towards justice. And yet when it comes to race, how we got here is not the same. This distinction was sharpened this past Shabbat when we read in the section of the book of Exodus where the Israelites were finally released from Egyptian slavery. And yet the Egyptians didn't let them just go. They chased after them until the Israelites reached the Sea of Reeds. A miracle occurred which allowed the Israelites to pass through the sea while the Egyptians drowned behind them. When the Israelites passed through the sea, they sang a song of freedom. Now, a couple weeks ago, the Human Relations Commissions of Palo Alto presented a study of Black and Brown Palo Alto history and current experience. In the report, there were testimonials from people of color of various ages and backgrounds who either lived here or grew up here. And one of them was a college student named Frederick Hudson Alexander, who grew up in Palo Alto. And he told the story of when he was in second grade, they were doing a project on ancestors. And the teacher asked the students, "How do you think your ancestors felt when they got to America?" Well, my ancestors in the Torah and my personal ancestors, when they crossed the sea and came to these shores, they probably would answer that they were singing with joy. Frederick Hudson Alexander answered the question of how his ancestors felt with one word: unhappy. Our ancestors came on very different ships, and we have a lot of work to do together to get in the same boat when it comes to racial justice. This is why I'm very glad that we are here together tonight. We've been together to learn and fight for justice at our borders with Professor Warren Binford. We formed a joint Spark-Itz working group to educate ourselves and take action. And we have been protesting together on Sundays along El Camino for Black Lives Matter. And following today's talk, we want to organize another joint working group to fight racism together. I'm so grateful to Jemar Tisby for joining us today and to Spark.Church for bringing him and giving us this opportunity to amplify his teaching. Things are different now. We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them before. We need a new approach to fight racism. I'm ready to learn. I'm ready to roll up my sleeves. And I hope you too will be, as we build together a beloved community towards justice, dignity, and the worth of every human being, b'malchut Shaddai, towards a kingdom of God.
Thanks so much, Chaim. We so appreciate you. Last little bit before we welcome Jamar, we encourage you to tweet using the hashtag #HowToFightRacism. Follow at Jemar Tisby. This event is on YouTube where it's going to live in perpetuity. So if you missed any of the conversation or you have to miss, you'll of course be able to come back and review it and of course share this video. Please use the YouTube comment function respectfully, honoring the spirit of tonight's event and most of all the dignity of all people involved. For example, it would be really wonderful if you could all share with us, hello from ... whether you're from a congregation or a city or a state or wherever, so we can see you. And I'm going to be perusing the comment section periodically for pertinent interjections into the conversation. Towards the end, we'll be taking live conversations from all of you from Sli.do, event number 66173. The link has been provided to you in the YouTube video description, as well as in all the emails we sent out, as well as on the webpage at Spark.Church/HowToFightRacism. So hopefully it's easy for you to see. And please submit questions and then upvote them so that together you as a community can partner with us in crafting tonight's event. That's Sli.do, Sli.do, event number 66173. Okay, I think that's all the housekeeping. With all that out of the way, everyone, let's welcome Jemar Tisby. Hey, Jamar, how are you doing? Good to see you. And then hello to everybody that's already given some locations of where you're at. It's so great to see everybody saying hello from all these different locations. Jamar, thank you so much for taking some time out to be with us. This is already, there's so many people logged on right now. It's so fantastic. You were with us in August of 2019, having tacos and Chinese food. And can I tell you how sad I am that we're not having tacos right now? Yeah, so that's a huge lament. Your leadership, your work, and your voice has been incredibly influential for our advocacy, our education, all that kind of stuff. So I just want to start off by saying thank you so much. And since August of 2019, quite a bit has happened. And so I want to start with our time together with the question, how are you doing? But I don't want to just ask it in kind of the nice, we're going to do a nice, how are you doing before we get to the real stuff. I want to ask, how are you actually doing? And part of the context of that question is all of the events that have happened since August of 2019, including the killing of George Floyd and the protests that emerged out of that. But you also start your book by saying something is different this time. But since that time, we also had January 6th with a little bit of an insurrection, And so with all of that in the background, your sentiment that something really is different this time, I would love to kind of hear your reflections on how you are actually doing in the midst of all of that context.
I am anxious and bringing it to the Lord in prayer. That line, something is different this time, was one of the lines I was most nervous about writing in the book. And it's the very first line. And I was nervous about it because it's so easily disproven over time.
Right.
There's a sense in which we won't know if it's different until, years down the road. But I spend the next, the first couple of pages in the book, How to Fight Racism, explaining why I think it's different this time. And this is going to strike folks in California and other places differently. But the state flag of Mississippi finally came down, y'all. Like that is not a small thing. That flag has flown, casting its racist shadow over the state since 1894. 126 years. And in 2020 is when it finally came down. And there are reasons for that. It's because of this historic level of uprising in support of racial justice, right? And that's just one small sign. But even as we look at the events of January 6th and really events from November on to now, one of the things that we have to realize, I've been saying this again and again, and I stand by it, is that we're in the civil rights movement of our day. Let that strike you. So I mean that in the sense that the same way we look back at the movement of the 1950s and 60s is the same way that, should the Lord tarry, we're going to look back at the movement in the 2010s and 2020s. And so one of the things that we need to understand as we, try to place ourselves historically within racial justice movements is it's not just about the progress we make, it's about the opposition we face. It's not just about the progress we make, it's about the opposition we face. And so every time there is a broad movement for racial justice, there's backlash, or what some people have called white lash. There's this forceful uprising of resistance to racial justice. And I think the events of January 6th and many other events are signs of that resistance. And you can tell the progress you're making or the potential that you have based on the pushback that you received. Yeah. And if the pushback we're seeing right now is any indication, then our potential for change is massive.
Right. And I think I heard you, by the way, I heard your talk at Baylor. No, not Baylor, Calvin College, which was incredible because I've been to West Michigan and can remember the context and all of the things you mentioned there in that talk, as well as other places. And many others have said this as well, that, looking back at history of the civil rights movement of the 60s, it's easy for us to say, well, if I were there, then I would have been involved. But you make a very clarion point that
what you are doing right now in the civil rights movement of our day is exactly what you would have done in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. So don't say you would have boycotted, protested, picketed, been on the right side of racial justice then if you aren't doing it now.
Yeah. Okay. So fantastic. You close your book with this beautiful paragraph, and this is kind of a follow-up to the first question. We cannot give up. We are people of hope. Hope is not blind optimism. It is a realistic assessment of our current conditions with the faith that tomorrow can be different. So this might be hopefully not terribly redundant, but what is the realistic assessment of our current conditions? Can you kind of sum it up for those of us who are here? Give us that realistic assessment so we can know our place from which we launch into the faith that tomorrow can be different.
My realistic assessment is that much of this nation remains in the grip of white supremacy. And as we talk about Christians, many Christians remain in the grip of white Christian nationalism. And my concern is that if we do not hold insurrectionists, for example, accountable now, we're going to see more and worse in the future.
Yeah. But Jamar, shouldn't we be trying to unify? I mean, we have a new president and we want to come together. We want to have bipartisanship. And, can't we just leave the past behind and we have to be unified?
Yeah. Unity has to be based on truth. And right now we have a disagreement on basic truth, like whether the election was fair and legal and legitimate, right? Like for two now almost 3 months, there's a broad section of society that has believed just outright lies about widespread election fraud. And how can you unify over a lie, right? So and also we see this in our churches. I experienced this in 2015, 2016, right around election season, presidential election season. I was in a multiracial church. It was beautiful. We had gospel choir. We had black and white people. This is in Mississippi where this stuff is not supposed to happen, right? And it wasn't until we really started talking about politics, which is about policy, which is about how we structure our interactions together as a society, right? That we started to see that this veneer of unity was based on a very shallow and superficial coming together. And that when the truth about what we believed about Black people, about what we believed about poor people, about what we believed about immigrants, when that came out, we discovered we were not nearly as unified as we thought.
You're right.
So let's start telling the truth, and then we can talk about unity.
Yeah. Yeah. The call to unity is often, well, not often, most frequently used as a way of dismissing all of those truths, right? And that it's amazing how subtle, because it reminds me of your previous book, The Color of Compromise, in which we often say things that sound very virtuous, but the virtuosity of the sound of that phraseology actually is hiding and cloaking the compromise and the complicity of racism and bigotry and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
I'll give you a perfect example. Just preach the gospel.
Right.
I don't know if y'all have heard that,
right.
but you know, oftentimes when we bring up issues of justice, particularly racial justice, people will say, "Why are you bringing that up? That's divisive. We just need to preach the gospel." Right. Which sounds so virtuous.
Right.
Of course.
Right.
Let's, you know, in a Christian frame, right? Like, or whatever sort of religious tradition you're from, focus on, you know, the essential message of your religion, and let's not talk about this, you know, controversial stuff. It sounds virtuous, but it's actually, I don't think you can unify without healthy conflict and constructive dialogue. So it's a deflection, like you said.
Yeah. I'm debating on whether or not I want to jump immediately to awareness in your book based upon your comment. Let me go through a couple of these other general questions that I have, and then we're going to get right into the heart of the content of your book, How to Fight Racism, which is, again, fantastic, amazing work.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to acknowledge, by the way, thank you everybody for commenting on YouTube. I see people from The Awakenings and obviously The River and Etz and Spark. It's so fantastic to have all of you here. The Cove Church in Santa Rosa is represented, and I know I'm missing some others. So we're just so thrilled that you guys are tuned in. Just want to acknowledge your presence. We are mainly a Christian audience, but we are a multi-faith audience too. We are partnered with Congregation Etz Chaim. Chaim give the introductory remarks here. And I wasn't able to pull it up, but we have the historical record of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel having marched with MLK in the 60s. And I'm kind of curious if you could share some reflections speaking to the history and the value of the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community, made all the more painfully poignant given January 6th, because not only did we see symbols of white supremacy, we saw symbols of anti-Semitism, which are obviously tied together. So I'm just kind of curious if you could share some of your reflections of your work, given the multi-faith congregation audience that we have here and the fight together. And they're obviously two very distinct experiences, but a lot of common struggles, I suppose.
Yep.
So.
Yep. First of all, I am so thankful. This is a multi-faith event, and I'm honored that y'all would tune in to hear me. Historically speaking, and really even theologically speaking, there is a solidarity in suffering. There is a fellowship in oppression, and I think people from historically marginalized and oppressed groups get it in a way that others struggle to. So when people of Jewish background, faith, and culture see the suffering and oppression of Black people, they have a cultural memory of that. And not just a memory, unfortunately, this is ongoing, right? And so there's a sense in which they understand the pain, they understand the exclusion, they understand the targeting, and will ally and partner with other groups in fighting that. It also goes back to something, you know, Martin Luther King and other activists used to say, that we're tied together in this inextricable web of mutuality, right? That what happens to one group is going to happen to other groups as well. That my liberation is tied up in your liberation. So it was really inspiring, actually, in 2020, as we looked at these racial justice uprisings, which were not only historic in scale, but historic in composition. And so we had a lot of different kinds of people coming together. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, it was mainly black people leading. And yes, we had allies and advocates along with us. But when you look at the marches and everything, it's predominantly a black group. Now, you have some marches and protests that are predominantly white people. You know, it's wild. But I do think that people who are in marginalized and oppressed groups, we ought to understand that our freedom is tied to your freedom, and none of us are free until all of us are free. Yeah. So I think, you know, that's some of the historic ties there that I'm glad to see is still ongoing. Yeah.
Okay, MLK has his famous quote, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I heard Ta-Nehisi Coates once say that he actually doesn't believe that the arc of the universe doesn't bend towards justice. And I would like for you to settle the score, who's right and who's wrong. I think I obviously understand some of the nuances of what both are saying, but I would love to hear your reflections from where you sit on the moral arc bending towards justice. And I think there's a sense of determinism, but there's also a sense of activism that is needed in that as well. So I was just kind of curious what you think about that.
As we pursue justice in any field, we're always in this tension between hope and reality. Yeah. And so Martin Luther King Jr., understand his position as sort of the most public-facing leader of the civil rights movement. And much of his work was to inspire hope and to encourage people to perseverance. And to that end, he's looking toward the future, right? This is 1963, I Have a Dream speech. He knows that's not the reality. But he has a hope. And even his very last speech, I've been to the mountaintop, the night before he was assassinated, is that his last lines, "I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land," right? This is forward looking, even as he recognizes in that single statement, what was the beginning? "I may not get there with you." That's not as real as you can get, right? Wow. So King was not naive in saying the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. What King was doing is being an inspirational leader. What King was doing is casting a vision. What King was doing was articulating a prophetic imagination. What Ta-Nehisi Coates is doing is being a realist and saying, you know, where we are now, and even as you look at history, man, look. So I think what is most salient about objections to that arc of the moral universe thing is it's pushing back against the erroneous idea that we will make progress simply by the passage of time. Yeah. There is this sometimes unarticulated sense that we can all fall into, which is that things will be better in the future just because it's the future. And the more we learn, the more we grow, the better the world will get. Well, I think folks like Ta-Nehisi Coates push back on that idea, and what's underlying it is the fact that the arc of the moral universe doesn't bend by itself. Yeah, it has to be bent. To the extent that we have made progress from then to now, or from now in the future, it is because people have refused to give up, and they have refused to be complacent with an unjust status quo. Yeah. So the arc of the moral universe doesn't bend by itself.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Do you run into folks who are, I suppose, awakened by this particular cultural moment that we're in, that have, and I'm speaking primarily about white folks, I suppose, that have an expectation that this is going to happen now, and there's like almost an exhaustion or a stamina problem of I get involved, but it's not happening as fast as I want. I think I'm just struck once again by your reminding us, MLK's statement that I may not get there. Like the effort that we're a part of is a long and generational effort. And I wonder if you run into some resistance from some folks right now that expect, but it has to happen right now on my watch, and we're going to be the ones to do it. And the tension between those two things?
Yeah, great. We have to have this mind among ourselves that we are laboring for a legacy. We're laboring for a legacy. We are activists now in order to be good ancestors later.
Oh, that's so good.
Right?
That's so
There is certainly a sense in which our efforts now may simply be planting seeds, may be watering the seeds, but we may not actually see the fruit or the growth or the increase in our lifetimes. I am absolutely certain that I, Jemar Tisby, am the product of praying ancestors, grandmamas and great-grandmamas and great-great-great-grandmamas, right? And they were praying for a reality where their descendants, people like me, would have more freedom and more liberty and more justice than they did. Yeah. And we do the same thing, right? We know that we are working for a reality that we may not get to experience, but our descendants may get to experience. And we have to have that in mind because, it's almost like running. Are you a runner?
Man, you just called me out publicly.
You look like you're in shape, so that's why I asked.
I try.
I can guarantee you're a better runner than I am. I got into running in 2020 just because it was a pandemic. It was like my only excuse to get outside, and I loved it. But I am the slowest runner you've encountered and the most out of shape. Nevertheless, on any run, it behooves us to understand that the next step is probably not the finish line, that we have to pace ourselves. Right? That we have to develop a rhythm and a cadence in this work so that we can finish the race. Yeah. And so this is the idea of, laboring for that legacy is about pacing. It's about making sure that we can stay in it, and it's not just for a summer or a weekend or a month. It's for a lifetime.
Yeah, and I think that's some of the concern that I know some of us have is that, what happened in May of 2020 and the kind of global movement has wonderful energy to it, but the concern is that energy will die down over time, that this is a long journey, and it is the encouragement to all who are joining us on this conversation and who have been involved or have been awakened. The word I'm using, I don't know if this is appropriate, is that they've now gotten groggy. They're not necessarily woke, but they're groggy. They've kind of like all of a sudden
they're stirring.
They're stirring. Is to keep continuing on with that journey. So that's that's part of why we're doing this work and why we're so grateful that you're here. For those who haven't picked up your book yet, you have an analogy in here that just struck me so powerfully, of a light switch versus a smoke alarm. That for white people, fighting racism is like a light switch that can be turned on and can be turned off. But for black people and people of color, racial justice is a smoke alarm. It's always on. It's always having to be aware. And I would just love to give you a moment to speak to both black folks and people of color and white folks. What would you like them to know through that analogy, through that metaphor? What kind of message would you like to give to each of us regarding that perspective, which I thought was so, it's such a wonderful image that I really appreciate.
I probably am borrowing it from somebody smarter than I, and I just don't remember. But thank you for pointing that out. So what I find with, white supremacy thrives on invisibility and deniability, right? So the way it functions for white people is that most of the time you don't think of yourself as having a race or having a culture. You're just Mike or Susie or John or whatever. You're just an individual. And so when you do get awakened or groggy or you start to stir about racial justice, like we saw in 2020, it can be really easy that once the headlines pass, once the marches cease, racism is not something that adversely affects you on a day-to-day basis because you're white, so you actually benefit from it if you're not conscious about it. Then you can shut that light switch off. So you can flick it on for a while it's in the headlines and in the news, and then you can turn it right back off because it's inconvenient, because it's going to require too much change, because you don't know enough, whatever it might be. And so the challenge for white people is keep that on. Mm-hmm. That's what solidarity is. That's what allyship is. That's what advocacy is keeping that light switch on when you have the option to turn it off. And that's a real challenge. Now, for black people and people of color, it's a smoke detector. A smoke detector only functions if it's always on, right? In the sense of it's got to be ready at any moment to detect smoke, which which indicates fire. And that's what's exhausting. Yeah. That's what's exhausting about being Black in America, speaking of my experience, right? Because, I used to say every time a Black person walks out of their home, they have to be aware. But reality is, it's even when we're in our homes, right? Do we remember Botham Shem Jean? Yeah. That a white off-duty police officer went to the wrong floor, wrong apartment, and saw a Black man in there, shot to kill, killed him, right? Do we remember Breonna Taylor? She's in her home asleep and no-knock warrant, killed in a hail of bullets. So it's the exhaustion of always being on, of always having to be sensitive, of always having to be aware of your surroundings. It's the exhaustion of going on a road trip and telling my 10-year-old son, we can't stop here for gas to go to the bathroom. We got to wait till we get to a more urban area, more diverse area, or whatever it is. Like, that's still happening. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So what I say to Black people and people of color is, goes back to that pacing thing. Like, we're going to have to cultivate spaces that are safe. Yeah. We're going to have to cultivate communities and even physical spaces and geographies where we can breathe. We're not going to change this whole thing in a day or a month or a year, but we need to find ways that we can not have to be so hyper vigilant all the time. Yeah.
One of the elements of the question, how are you doing, that I neglected to press you on was, how are you doing as somebody who has taken it upon your shoulders to be that voice and advocate? I think the thing that was weighing on my heart is this tension of the almost necessity it is for white people to hear from Black folks. I need you to teach me, while at the same time, it shouldn't be Black folks' responsibility to do that teaching, to do that education. Is there anything or wisdom or insight you can share regarding that tension and how to navigate that, especially as somebody who, you now do this for a living? Yeah.
Well, I wrote this book, and hopefully that saves Black folks and people of color some time and energy. Where, if somebody asks you to educate them, I actually now have 2 books here. Read The Color of Compromise. Here, take How to Fight. Take 2 of these and call me in the morning.
That's right.
Exactly. So there are resources, and that's helpful because it's sort of like a litmus test, right? If white folks are coming to you asking these questions, but they're not willing to do sort of a basic minimum of educating themselves, you need to move on. And so what I say to Black people and people of color is, we have to have healthy boundaries. Otherwise, we're going to be, sort of run to exhaustion. That's something that I constantly wrestle with. It's not like I've got it figured out. I will say I've gotten a whole lot better at not reading the comments. I've gotten a whole lot better about not arguing with people online. It's very fruitless. And especially in a pandemic, like, group text messages have become a lifeline, really. I mean, for big things and little things, for funny things and serious things, like, you got to have a community. And I'll say, these communities don't come up by themselves. You got to cultivate it. Yeah. You got to seek people out. You might need to send a text message tonight to somebody, be like, hey, I feel exhausted, lonely, isolated. I know you're someone who gets it. Can we just, connect once in a while? And it doesn't have to be intense, y'all. Doesn't have to always be, let's have this deep heart to heart about the state of race relations today. It can be, hey, did you see this new series on Netflix, right? Like, the normal sort of mundane quotidian moments are kind of what keep us afloat sometimes.
Yeah. I want to ask you about how you define racism. Your book is How to Fight Racism. And it was interesting to me because in some of the study and engagement that I've had, racism is very, I shouldn't say clearly defined, but pushed towards defining the systemic problems. And so racism is something that's institutionalized and systemic, whereas there's bias and prejudice in the much more interpersonal relationship kinds of ways. Mm-hmm. But your outline is awareness, relationships, and commitment. So I was just kind of wondering if you could help me navigate that entire journey and how you define racism. Because when I was reading your book, it felt to me like the bifurcation, or at least the separation that a lot of people have, that racism is systemic, and then anything that's prejudicial is prejudice and bias, and that's maybe a little bit different. We shouldn't necessarily call that racism. And I don't know how much of a debate there is in that. And then, sorry for making this question so much longer, you share in your book this wonderful story where you had an Asian American staff member and a cultural misunderstanding. And I was like, but Jamar, that to me at least wasn't a racist incident where you had a cultural misunderstanding per se. So I'm wondering if you can help me navigate your definition of racism and maybe the interplay of both bias and prejudice with racism as we all use it, to help get some clarity around that.
So, of course, with every definition, we have denotation and connotation, right? And so much of how I navigate racial justice conversations is about connotations. And so in The Color of Compromise, I make it very explicit that I borrow a definition of racism from social psychologists like Beverly Daniel Tatum, which says racism is a system of oppression based on race. And that system part is really important because it means that a certain group of people have the power to put their prejudice into policy. A certain group of people have the power to put their prejudice into policy, which is not true of every racial and ethnic group. Now, the reason I use this definition is to sort of head off accusations of reverse racism, if you've heard that term. Reverse racism is often used by people in the majority, in this case, white people, to say, well, black people hate white people too. And basically they want to set up what I would say is a false equivalency that the issue of racism falls equally to every racial and ethnic group. And that's simply not how it functions in society. In society, because we have a white supremacist racist system, people who are white benefit actively and passively from that system. And people who are white have the power economically, politically, socially, culturally, you name it, to actually enshrine their prejudice into laws and policies. And so that's where we get, the Dred Scott decision, which said the white man doesn't have any, or the black man doesn't have any rights that the white man needs to respect. That's where we get Jim Crow, segregation. That's where we get voter suppression and gerrymandering and all of these things. Well, guess what? Black people don't have all that power to do that. So it's not at all to say that just because you're a certain skin color, you can or cannot act in racist ways. It is to say that racism goes beyond the individual and interpersonal, and it has to do with the way our society is structured in terms of policies, practices, and laws. Okay, so that's what I get at with racism. The arc of racial justice, I think you need all three to have a holistic approach to racial justice. And so think of a stool, right? You need those three legs to have a firm foundation. And it's also, I think, a helpful taxonomy for us to constantly interrogate our own racial justice practices. During Black History Month, it's going to be really easy to build your awareness. There's going to be facts every day. There's going to be stories. There's going to be the inventors, the poets, the whatever, right? You're going to build your awareness of race, racism, white supremacy, Black history. That's great. But what else? Obviously, there's more to it. There's a relational aspect. In a religious frame, all reconciliation is relational. We cannot forget that we're dealing with real people. At the end of the day, love God, love your neighbor, right? Like we can't abstract this just to laws and policies. We can't void it of its human element. It's also an injunction to white people. Do you remember how vigorously and strenuously white folks put up barriers to separate themselves from Black and brown people and other people of color? So guess what? You're going to have to work just as strenuously to knock down those barriers and build bridges. For Black people and people of color, it means a couple of things. One, you may have to separate from some relationships. that are toxic and exploitative. You're also going to have to pursue relationships with people who get it and understand. But we can't stop there. So the commitment aspect, and I know we'll get into this more deeply, but the commitment aspect says, yeah, we do have to change laws and policies. Like, it's not just enough to take the sort of typical like white evangelical approach, just, change one heart at a time. You say the sinner's prayer and automatically you become not racist, and that's the way you change society. No.
Right.
We got to do something about the systems and the structures that create and maintain inequality.
Yeah. Well, you're getting us into it. Can we spend the next few moments teasing out some of the elements in your book then? We'll go through each particular piece. I agree with you. The taxonomy of it, awareness, relationships, and commitment. I mean, it's so easily accessible, memorable, and actionable, which is the most important piece of the puzzle. We alluded to this earlier in the conversation, and I'd love to pursue it here, because in both awareness and relationships, there is a deep theological foundation upon which you build, which is very much in line with the deep, robust, profound theological convictions of even the civil rights movement as well. In awareness, you take us back to the imago Dei, what Jews would call the B'Tselem Elohim, the image of God. And in the relationships piece, you also take us back there. And I love how you teased out reconciliation. And some people say, well, we can't have reconciliation because there was no conciliation. But you root us back to the original Genesis story. So I'm wondering if you could just tease out for our folks here, what is, I guess it's both awareness and relationships at the same time, because those are kind of the first two things. But what is that theological or ideological, philosophical foundation upon which you're building your case?
So I make a lot of bold statements. Time will prove me right or wrong. But one of the analogies I come back to is the Protestant Reformation in Europe was all about the doctrine of salvation, or soteriology in theological terms. It was about salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, right? And that was sort of, there was a lot of other stuff that went along with it, but that was kind of the central hinge point that really sparked a big movement. And I think every sort of reformational movement is going to have a particular hinge point. And I think in the 21st century, if there was to be a religious reformation, the key doctrine would be the imago Dei.
Yeah.
Why do I say that? In the United States, we live in the most racially and ethnically diverse country in the world. We have so many different people groups from so many different backgrounds that a deep and thorough and rich understanding of the imago Dei would teach us how to interact with people who are different, right? And this goes beyond race and ethnicity. This goes to class. This goes to gender. This goes to heterosexual, LGBTQ, all of that. How do you get along with people who are different from you, especially when our world has become so much smaller due to technological innovations, transportation, the internet, all of that stuff. And especially when we're looking at issues of race. How do we actually theologize around the image of God in the 21st century such that we are teaching folks what it means to be made, to be fearfully and wonderfully made, right? And to be made a little lower than the angels, and how we ought to dignify and respect one another because of that. So I just think it's a central doctrine. So I take a lot of time in the book to unpack that, especially in the awareness section, because one thing that I think we ought not to do, a lot of people ask me, well, how do you begin these conversations with folks who aren't awake, who aren't even groggy, right? Never assume they know what the sacred text says about race and ethnicity. Never assume that. Never assume even right? So I do think it behooves us to, even though it seems sort of self-evident to people who've been on this journey, it behooves us to walk through that with people. And so I walk through that a little bit in the book. And then in the relationships aspects, it's just building on that. If we are indeed all made in the image of God, then how do we cultivate, healthy relationships that are not colorblind, as if the differences don't exist, but how do we acknowledge those differences but even celebrate them? So I think that's how those two fit together.
It's amazing how our theologies sometimes find these marker points, right? Like we have a Bible that goes back to the very beginning, in the beginning, or when God began to create. And then we evolve and we change over time, and it develops over time. And at some particular point, 16th century Reformation. That's the point where we then kind of put an anchor in. And I love your a clarion call to us to remember that, 16th century Reformation wasn't the fullness of our religious heritage. I mean, we've got a full, long religious heritage, faith heritage that goes back to the Genesis story. So I so appreciate that. And it just struck me now how I think difficult it might be for some, I know for Christians, for the Jewish folks in our community, there's a much stronger connection to the Torah, to the books of Moses and all of that. But I think for Christians, it's going to be, I think that's going to be a little struggle because like you said, the doctrine of salvation and the point of just getting people across that line is so strong.
That's right. We have so much to learn from our Jewish sisters and brothers because, as I understand it, there's a much more communal understanding of the Imago Dei, right? There's a sense in which we individualize the Imago Dei, where it's just me. Every individual is made in the image of God, and that's true. But what does it mean for entire people groups, for entire ethnicities and cultures and languages, for all of that to reflect the image of God as well? And I think folks from the Jewish tradition have a much more robust understanding that we can learn from.
Yeah. Okay. Awareness. Why should I explore my own racial identity?
I love this one. Yeah. So in the book, I structure the book very sort of consistently. Every chapter starts with some sort of story or illustration about that subject. And then I have something called essential understandings, which are sort of the philosophical underpinnings of what's coming next, which is called racial justice practices. And so one of the racial justice practices I recommend that seems to be really resonating with people is writing your own racial autobiography. And I love this one because anybody can do it. You just need pen and paper or a screen and keyboard and your memories. And it's important because even as we look to pursue racial justice in the world, in our community, in our nation, we actually leave a lot of our own sort of racial baggage unexamined. And it is extremely powerful to sit down and write out answers to questions like, what's the first memory I have of race? Have I ever used a racial slur or been called a racial slur? When did I start to get concerned or have a burden about racial justice? What happened? What did my parents teach me along these lines? I just think that's an extremely valuable exercise, not just for white people, but for everyone, because there may be some pain that is unacknowledged. There may be some relationships that have been broken or strained that we want to revisit. There may be some triumphs that we need to acknowledge. And I think there's this really important inner work that needs to be done, even as we pursue the more external work of racial justice.
Beautiful. Why should we take down the monuments, Jamar?
My. Don't get me started now. This is history. This is the South. This is all the stuff I'm passionate about. The short answer is symbols shape narratives. So I really kind of bristle when people look at like racial justice changes and say, oh, that's just symbolic. But I'm like, symbols are important because symbols shape the stories we tell about who we are and about our society. And so again, back to the state flag of Mississippi coming down. That's very important for the story that not only Mississippians, but the entire United States tells about itself. And it's the same with Confederate monuments. I'm getting my PhD in history at the University of Mississippi. And up until 2020, this is another sign of change. Up until 2020, there was a Confederate monument at the entrance of campus. And so this monument to Confederate soldiers is supposed to welcome you to campus. That didn't feel too welcoming to me, right? And it's just a symbol, but it's also it's part of a narrative, the Lost Cause narrative,
Yeah.
which was a story that white people told themselves to make sense of their experience, losing the Civil War, but not wanting to, losing their antebellum culture,
Yeah.
but not wanting to.
Yeah.
And so those are symbols of story. The last thing I'll say about these Confederate monuments, it's not just what we take down, it's what we put up.
Mm-hmm.
So I am eager to take down, the white supremacist slaveholder person who massacred black soldiers, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I'm eager to put up statues to Ida B. Wells, who was born in Mississippi, lived for a time in Memphis, and got run out of there because she told the truth about lynching, right? I'm eager to put up monuments and memorials to Fannie Lou Hamer. I got Fannie Lou Hamer here and Ella Baker, two of my historical heroes who pursued black civil rights in a very grassroots, equitable kind of way. We need monuments to those folks too. So again, prophetic imagination, it's not just what we see, it's not just what we're taking down, it's what could be, and it's what we could put up.
Yeah. Well, and you make the point in your book that to remove the monuments does not mean we're trying to erase history, because there's a difference between history and veneration. And I really appreciated that point, that we can and we must still study the history, but the monuments are a veneration. They're expressing our values. They're expressing the things that we care about. Yeah. Okay, relationships. We're starting to run a little bit short on time, so we'll do our best to try to get through some of this stuff. You have this great quote: if you have not learned to lament, you have not learned to love. When love is betrayed and people hurt others because of racial arrogance, it is cause for lament. Every community dedicated to racial justice should have a canon of songs devoted to lament.
Yeah.
I don't really have a question. I just think that needs to be said. It was just so beautiful and poignant. And I know, well, for some of the context that I come from and that I swim in, there is a strain of Christian evangelicalism that is celebratory, positive. And I think it's really, really difficult for us, for some in that strain, to cry and to weep and to embrace the pain and the suffering of others.
I think so one of the most frequent critiques of my first book, The Color of Compromise, is that I don't talk about like the white Christians who opposed racism. And I think that's so illustrative. Number one, I don't do that because they're the exception that proved the rule. Like it was not the typical or the norm for white Christians to oppose racism. And number two, I think it's so indicative of this leap toward triumphalism and exceptionalism, right? And what I want people to do is dwell with the pain of racism, with the harm that it caused. And what I say in the introduction of The Color of Compromise, it's not about white guilt. It's about godly grief leading to repentance. And if you haven't learned to grieve over these injustices, then you cannot be part of repairing them.
Yeah. I love how you tie lament to love, because that's what it is to love somebody, is to embrace the fullness of their pain and their suffering, the full life of what they're carrying around. I guess I did have one slight question. Is there a danger of romanticizing or fetishizing Black suffering, where, I don't know, some people could take it on kind of as a pet project, and that is like that is deeply offensive and a violation of the fundamental principle. Is that a danger, or am I just conjuring up something that really isn't something to worry about?
I think you're exactly right. We should always be constantly questioning ourselves in the sense of, do we think that we're the healthy ones who have all the answers and all the resources, and we are sort of condescending to go down and help these suffering people? Or do we see other people, even though they experience suffering and oppression, as our equals, from whom we have something to learn and gain, and from whom we can follow as well? So I think, it is constantly us looking at ourselves, and this goes across the racial and ethnic spectrum, but looking at ourselves to say, do I think I'm the okay one going to help you who are not okay? and recognizing that we're all not okay in a lot of different ways, and we can learn from each other on an equal basis. The other thing I'll say about this is that's an especially important concern to bring up during Black History Month.
Yes. Yeah.
Because so much of there's this tension, right, where so much of Black history has been obscured, and so much of the racism and injustice we've experienced has been obscured, that we rightfully want to bring that to light. But it's not as if that's the only part of our experience.
Yeah.
There's culture making, there's joy, there's complexity there. And so it is a challenge then, as we build our awareness, to have a robust picture of Black experiences.
Good. Tease out for us the important distinctions between diversity and inclusion.
So diversity is, people are present in the room, people who are different. Inclusion is that they feel truly part of the community, and that tends to come from having a say in how things are done. And so we have too many stories of racial and ethnic minorities going to predominantly white institutions, churches, congregations, whatever it might be, and them celebrating diversity. It's the picture on the brochure. It's the, we have this percentage of minorities, right? But it's not true inclusion, because nothing actually changes, right? The minority always has to accommodate for the majority. And it's seldom a two-way street. And so this sense of inclusion isn't there. And so what I talk about, and it's become a byword for some because people adopt this language but don't really put any action behind it. What I talk about is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the book. And for Christians especially, this diversity thing ain't enough, because if it's not premised on justice and equity and inclusion, then it becomes, it can actually do more harm than good.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was chuckling there, because I was remembering painfully an institution that I know of who had, I think, 2 or 3 Black kids out of 1,000, and it was like, oh, there they are on that brochure, and they're on the front page of the website, and they're over here. It's like, so it's unfortunately a very real thing. So, and I think diversity, is the brochure. It's the front page, it's the marketing, but inclusion is the power structure. And
that's right.
Inclusion has to upend how the organization or institution actually works and functions. And the cultural nuances of that organization have to shift and change too, which is a much harder sell for people in power, because you have to give things up, right? Friends, we're kind of coming close to our time. I want to remind you that the Sli.do is up, and we already have a couple questions that I'm looking forward to asking Jamar. Please make sure, and I do see some of the questions coming through the YouTube comments, and I apologize, there's been so many comments, I'm not going to be able to catch up with the comments on YouTube, but the Sli.do will be able to, if you can upvote and ask your questions, then that'll be really helpful when we get to the Q&R section there. Let's move to commitment. And a couple ideas and thoughts there. Steward your budget for justice. What, you want my money, Jamar? You want my money? I really appreciate how direct this section was, because I think for many people it's very easy. Well, there's several points of entry, but let's talk about diversity. Let's talk about being kind. Let's talk about racial justice, but don't talk about money and reparations. So tell us why stewarding your budget and even reparations, which is obviously a very politically charged term, is central to the fight against racism under the heading that you have, commitment.
Yeah, so much of racism and white supremacy is premised on economic exploitation. Race-based chattel slavery, that chattel part meant that Black people were considered property where you could attach a financial value to them. And also the resiliency of race-based chattel slavery had to do with the fact that plantation owners and those in that orbit financially enriched themselves because they never compensated their Black laborers. That's not just a race-based chattel slavery thing. This persisted during Jim Crow, when Black people were excluded from job opportunities, promotions, unions, educational opportunities, all of those things that might move us closer to wealth equity. uh, those things persisted up to the present day, where the wealth gap is not just enormous, it's growing. Right. So if we don't deal with economic justice when it comes to racial justice, we're just not having a serious conversation.
Yeah, that's tied to actually the awareness piece, which is you have to read history correctly, because I think, there's plenty, Rothstein wrote The Color of Law, and others have written extensively documenting how the economic policies were blatantly and explicitly racist, that white people had these privileges, black people could not have these privileges. And so once you have an awareness of the racial disparities within those policies, then the argument for reparations becomes the most sensical next step. And then,
exactly.
And then, of course, the tragedy of multiple generations over time.
Right.
This is actually deeply connected to something that somebody wrote in a book about the color of compromise also being green, not just red and not just white, but also green. So
exactly. Good memory.
So that's how we tie all this together. You have several suggestions which are very politically activated. Host a candidate forum, host a voter registration drive, host a freedom school that may be slightly less political. Make the case for the Christians specifically that are watching who are very shy to get involved politically because that might show divisiveness or whatever. Help us understand how this is both the commitment part of the arc of racial justice, but also tied to our faith and who we are as Christians. Help us navigate that.
So we have to deal with politics because of so much of racism is enshrined in policies, right? So the fact that black people could not vote for so long was a law that had to do with policy. So if you want to change it, you got to deal with politics. The other part is, I think when people hear politics, they automatically jump to partisan. And there are ways to talk about politics that are not automatically partisan. And so those are some of the suggestions I give in the book. Hosting a voter registration drive is Democratic little d, not big D Democratic Party. Republicans and Democrats and independents should all be in support of people having the right to vote and being able to exercise that with as few hurdles as possible. Hosting a candidate forum is similarly nonpartisan in the sense that you extend the invitation to all the candidates so they can be heard. And it acknowledges the fact that faith communities remain, sort of central pillars in the community for gathering and for information sharing. So the last thing I'll say is so much of our divisions are because of politics, right? Like, right now, the people who continue to support the previous president, it's really hard to find common ground with them. And so much of, I think, the misinformation, the conspiracy theories, the lies and everything, a lot of that has to do with many churches avoiding the topic, many faith communities avoiding the topic and letting their members be discipled more by the culture than by their faith commitments. And so until we start talking about it, we're seeding that, we're letting the conversation. It's almost like, how do you want your kids to learn about sex? It's a tough conversation. It's a very delicate conversation, but do you want to be the one to bring it up and sort of walk with them through that? Yeah. Or do you just want to leave that to YouTube and Facebook?
Yeah.
It's up to you.
Yeah. While I was reading the commitment portion of your book, I was thinking of Ibram X. Kendi's work and the general thesis that it is racist policies that lead to racist ideas. And that sounds so counterintuitive. Where you would think that the idea is what leads to the actual policies. And I was just really struck that your encouragement and exhortation to us to actually involve in policy actions, systems and institutions is actually the right way forward. It's not just trying to change somebody's mind. So that's connected with Kendi's work. Would you agree, or do you have any additional insights for me? It's one of the things that hit me while I was reading your work.
Yeah, certainly. Again, sort of the question of emphasis, particularly with Christians in the U.S. and white Christians, the emphasis has always been on the individual and the interpersonal, and particularly when it comes to race. And so, what I try to highlight is like that's true, that's important. How interpersonal attitudes are relevant, but they're not the whole story. And so, so much of it is like, I don't know, why people really think that Black people and people of color care a whole lot about how they feel. I care a little bit, but I am more concerned about structuring our society in ways that are equitable. Whether sort of have the light bulb come on for you or not. Mm-hmm. We cannot wait for racial justice for, everybody to sort of have this moment of awakening. We have to change laws, policies, systems, structures, institutions right now. And hopefully you'll come around in terms of your feelings. But at the end of the day, that's not my only concern. It may not even be my primary concern, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. In your book, you mention impact, not intent, and actions, not results. These are two phrases that kind of stuck out to me, and there was a little bit of a dissonance that I felt there. But I kind of like to rephrase the question in the sense of, I think there may be somebody watching who's maybe brand new or fresh to the journey, and they might be a little hesitant or reticent. I don't know if I'm going to make that big of a difference, or I'm not quite sure if this is really going to do all that much, etc. But your exhortation, it's your action, it's your, getting out there and participating. I'm wondering if you could just encourage those folks who might just be, I don't know.
Yeah, it gets to how we evaluate success, how we determine effectiveness of our racial justice efforts. And I'm concerned in terms of longevity and perseverance, that if we only look to sort of external changes, particularly like laws and policies that are passed or changed, we will get discouraged very quickly because this is long, hard, slow work. And so what I try to emphasize is that racial justice is not just how your efforts change the world, it's how your efforts change you. And so I fundamentally believe that pursuing righteousness is sanctifying. It does something good for your soul.
Yeah.
And we become better people. We become more humanized in that sense. We dignify the image of God in ourselves and others, even in the pursuit, no matter how sort of effective it is in earthly terms. And so I say that to help people and to maintain their commitment to this long, hard journey.
Yeah. So good, Jamar. So good. Thank you. Okay, friends, we're going to go to Sli.do, the number one upvoted question by Yehoma. So sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. Regarding the moment that we are in, does a focus on class in the national conversation versus race have any bearing on the movement? For example, Poor People's Campaign as parallel.
William Barber, Liz Theo Harris, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, and everyone who's sort of organizing and leading that, I think are doing a phenomenal job. The Poor People's Campaign, as I've interacted with these folks and understand it, is certainly not pitting class against race and saying it's all class or it's all race. What it is a revival of the movement that MLK and other civil rights activists were part of in the late 1960s, where they saw the interconnectedness of race and class and said, if we really want to pursue equity and justice, then it's not just about pressing on these issues of racism. It's recognizing that there's an economic element to it. Mm-hmm. So it goes back to our earlier conversation about reparations and all of that stuff. So in my view, and from a historical perspective, race and class are mutually constitutive, right?
Yeah.
So that we have this, unfortunately, permanent sort of wealth underclass or wealth gap, and that tends to fall along racial lines, and that's not by coincidence, right? So I would not, I guess my most direct sort of response is I would not bifurcate the two or pit them against each other. They are so intertwined. We can talk about them separately, but they are so intertwined that we when we're addressing one, we're addressing both.
Well, and I think most of the time when we bifurcate, we usually prop up one kind of as an argument to diminish the other too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So I've heard people say, look, why don't we just talk about class? And by talking about class only, then we eliminate the tension of race. And most people of color will also be benefited by just talking about class. Right. And it feels to me like that argument is a disdain of our very real history, that race is at the center of the economic policies that have got us to this particular point, right? So I like what you're saying is that, yeah, they can't be bifurcated. So that's a very helpful point. Mark asks, Silicon Valley is the wealthiest area of the United States. How do we combat the illusion of racial harmony here, all based on wealth?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd be interested in your answer as somebody who's there. Money can make really powerful illusions, right? Yeah. Here's the thing. I think, there was a report in the New York Times. It was reporting on a study. I can't remember exactly where it was or who did it, but it was saying that even Black millionaires, A, have less money, and B, are really, sort of one job loss, injury, disaster away from, falling down the ranks in terms of wealth. And that's more true of middle class and working class folks. So even within the wealthiest people, as you look across racial and ethnic lines, there are big differences. The only other thing, that comes to mind on this, the illusion of racial harmony, start talking about politics. That's going to dismantle illusions right quick. Start talking about Christian nationalism or religious nationalism more broadly. And, when you start to sort of press on the idols of a particular community or culture, you will very quickly get past the veneer of unity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mark also asks, which is, a difficult question. When, in your mind, is it time to separate from white churches that will not see injustice as a call of the church to confront? And I can imagine we have a lot of people joining us tonight who are part of predominantly white churches. So, yeah.
I'm going to speak real bluntly, and I hope circumspectly, but I would say soon. I say that because as we record this in February 2021, think of what we've seen in just the past 10 years. We saw the murder of Trayvon Martin. We saw the killing of Mike Brown and the Black Lives Matter movement take on a national scope. We saw a horrendous and tumultuous 4 years of a presidency and everything, all the ripple effects that go along with that, as far as divisions within faith communities, families even. We saw the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. We saw the Emanuel 9 massacre. We saw an insurrection on January 6th. So I say that because in light of all of this, very recent history, if people are still resistant to the idea of publicly supporting racial justice, I don't have a whole lot of hope that they're going to change their minds anytime soon. Because we've seen too much. Yeah. Like, what else do you need to see at this point? Yeah. So what I would say is, and I've been in this position before, exercise every established way to make your complaints known, to make your priorities known. Be able to say, if you do walk away, be able to say, I tried everything that was in place to make change, formal and informal, and they didn't listen. Yeah. Right. The other thing I'll say is the burden is different for Black people and people of color.
I was just going to ask that.
And white people.
Yep.
So white folks, a lot of this is on you. And I don't mean that you individually committed, some egregious racist act, but that white supremacy benefits you. And so many of the people who are resistant to these ideas, you're a lot closer to them than I am or another person of color is. And so I do think there is some sort of responsibility on the part of white people to bring this up and to make this a constant issue, right? At the same time, I'm not advocating for anybody of any race or ethnicity to remain in a toxic relationship, right? So that is something that you do have to carefully discern. I do also think it's going to be harder for white people just to get away from it in general, because even if you leave that church, it's in your families, it's in your social network of friends, right? So even if you leave a particular organization, that should actually in some ways embolden you to speak about it, because now they don't have institutional power over you.
Yeah.
There's a lot more I could say, but
yeah, no,
soon.
That's a really hard question, because there's so many different nuances, many of which you point out there. Friends, we are coming close to time, so we want to be respectful of everybody's time. I'm going to ask this one last question from Sli.do. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything. Thank you to everybody who conversed over the YouTube comments too. I took a quick scan, and there's really some wonderful insights and reflections there. Last question, and then we'll do some closing remarks from you, Jamar. How do you talk about Imago Dei as the foundation of racial justice with people who don't believe in God? And I'd like to add a little bit to that, because I was really struck with the emphasis that you have. I mean, the subtitle of the book, Courageous Christianity and the Journey Towards Racial Justice, you make a pretty compelling argument that Christianity, at least the faith of Christianity, I'll put it that way because I recognize that we're in a multi-faith audience here, needs to be at the center of the fight because of the theological foundation of the Imago Dei, etc. I was really struck by that. And I was kind of curious how that works within the broader global scope of racial justice for many people who are non-believers or secularists who are also fighting for that. So please help us. How do you talk about the Imago Dei as the foundation with people who don't believe in God?
So I think that this is a concept that people of various faith traditions or no particular faith background can understand. It's just that human beings have a dignity and worth that transcends any sort of earthly distinctions we might make about skin color, ethnicity, the language you speak, how much money you have, whether you are disabled or not, whatever it might be, right? I don't see, and I think you can root it back. You know, if you are a person of Jewish religion or Christian religion, you can say, in my tradition, we have this, doctrine or principle of the Imago Dei. In your tradition or your understanding, it might be different or in different terms, but we can all agree that we should treat one another with dignity and respect. And because of that, we need to advocate for justice and equity for one another. So I think this is actually one of the least controversial or the easiest sort of points of commonality that we can get along. And I'm a Christian, so I'm gonna speak from my perspective. And I would hope that you, if you come from a different faith tradition or don't claim a faith tradition, I hope you would speak from your perspective as well. And somehow we're having these conversations among people who are committed to justice. I don't know how you get there, but this is how I get there.
Yeah. Well, it's very reminiscent, of course. Maybe we'll close on this, to the call for the nation to live up to the commitments of its own creeds, that all men are created equal, which is a Genesis theological foundation encoded in our national founding documents. So you have some inroads there as well. Friends, the book is How to Fight Racism. If you don't have this book, make sure you get this, as well as The Color of Compromise, Jemar Tisby's New York Times Bestselling author. Man, that's so awesome.
Yeah, sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, amazing. To all of you from AITS and The River and Spark, thank you so much for joining us. And I saw a ton of other people from other churches as well. We're so grateful that you all joined us. If you happen to be a part of AITS and Spark, we're using this event as a launching pad to form a How to Fight Racial Justice working group. So if you are interested in that, we sent out some links in our email. So please make sure you sign up on that Google form, and we'd love to get in touch with you regarding how you can follow up from this, because it was our desire to not just have a conversation, but to actually do what Jamar has asked us to do in this and put this into action. And I know that the River, as well as other folks, have also participated in action steps as well. Let's see. I'm going to close. When we close, I'll have a graphic that'll give you all the respective websites for what Jamar is doing with The Witness, as well as Spark and Eds and the River and all that kind of stuff. Jamar, you have a book study club that started tonight. Yes?
Yeah.
Can people still sign up for that?
Absolutely. You can still sign up. It is an online How to Fight Racism book study group. You go to facebook.com/groups/HTFR community, How to Fight Racism. So you can still sign up. I did a Facebook Live tonight. It is still available. It will be available, the recording. So facebook.com/groups/HTFR community. And I really want to answer your questions. You had some great questions there. So there's a couple of ways we can handle that. One, you can request access to the group and post a question there. Or two, Kevin, if you wanted to, or somebody from your team wanted to go through and sort of highlight a few of the more frequently occurring ones, I can send you all a video with my 2 cents for whatever it's worth. But I just want to honor the people who've asked questions.
You're tremendously kind. Why don't we close this to be honorable to the time that we have here, and then why don't you and I quickly chat about how to take care of that. I'm going to have a slide up pretty soon with all the website information, all that kind of stuff. But to close us, Jamar, I would just love to ask you to give us your final words. Maybe preach at us a little bit if you want to put on your preacher hat. Just give us some last words of exhortation, encouragement. There are so many people signed on right now that really, really care, that want to do something about this. I'm inspired and encouraged about this. And I would just love for you to give us all the last word for tonight.
I think so much of this comes back to truth telling. And I want us to focus on relationships. I want us to focus on commitment. But for so many people, just telling the truth, grappling with the truth is a big hurdle. And it may not be a hurdle for you, but it's probably a hurdle for somebody in your network. And what I want to say is justice takes sides. I think we are dealing right now with issues of such moral clarity that silence is complicity. We're talking about separating kids at the border. We're talking about suppressing the votes of certain populations. We're talking about lies over election fraud. These are not, this side has a point, this side has a point. How do we debate? These are issues that have very clear moral and ethical stances. And I would encourage you to let your voice be heard. I would encourage you to not be afraid to take a side, even if it looks like you're being partisan or whatnot. And you can just say, look, this doesn't have to do with an elephant or a donkey. This has to do with what's right and what's wrong. So when you take that first step, you sort of declare yourself on the side of racial justice, boy, the issue is not going to be what to do. It's going to be figuring out where to start.
Man, justice takes sides. It's beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, Jemar Tisby, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your voice. Thank you for gracing us with this time. We know that you're a busy person, and we're so deeply grateful to you. So thanks. Good night, everybody, and we'll catch you next time. And if you were a part of any of this community, we'll let you know how to get answers to the other questions that were submitted through Sli.do. Have a good night, everybody.